start off by thanking you resilient folks for hanging out all day. I'm Doug Dominich again. I spoke earlier, so don't need to introduce myself again. The one thing I do want to say is we are starting breakfast tomorrow morning at 7:30 in the morning, again upstairs. We have Congressman Lamar Smith coming. He is the chairman of the House Science Committee, and he has been a superhero on the issue of the Clean Power Plan and climate. So he will be a huge treat. So please make an effort to be, to be there because you'll really enjoy it.
Okay.
And he's worth it. So tonight what we're going to do is talk about this.
There you go.
The forthcoming book by Kathleen Hartnett White and Stephen Moore, and they're going to chat in the comfy chairs with us for a little bit. And so as a way of introduction, and Kathleen's been introduced already once, but Kathleen is the Distinguished Senior Fellow in Residence and Director of the Armstrong Center for Energy and the Environment here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. She's was appointed to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, that's Texas's DEQ, under Rick Perry, and served under Governor Bush on the Texas Water Development Board, and she served actually as chairman of TCEQ. She's on the editorial board of the Journal of Regulatory Science, the Texas Emission Reduction Advisory Board, the Texas Water Foundation. Her articles have been published all over the place: National Review, Investors Business Daily, the Washington Examiner, Forbes, etc. And she's currently nearing completion of this very book that I'm talking about. So, so Kathleen, why don't you come forward, please, and take your place in the comfy chair number one. And then, yeah.
She's also a pretty good cook, too.
Oh, is that right?
My husband.
Oh, there you go. There you go. And I think you own some dogs or something. I don't know what that's about. Stephen Moore is the chief economist for the Heritage Foundation, very well-known national figure, founder and former president of the Club for Growth. He's a contributor to the Wall Street Journal and is a daily Fox News economics commentator. He's the author of 6 books. His latest one is entitled Who's the Fairest of Them All? And he's worked for 2 presidential commissions and received the Ronald Reagan Great Communicator Award from the Republican Party. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois, where he was awarded the 2010 Alumni of the Year, Alumnus of the Year, I don't know which that is, and he holds an MA in economics from George Mason University. Please welcome Stephen Moore. So I am now going to turn the podium over to Kathleen Hartnett White.
And it's very comfortable in that chair, perhaps too comfortable at the end of this long day. So I decided to stand up, but Steve may very well want to. We're just going to give you some highlights about the book and the range of the things it covers. Steve and I kind of divided up focus. I wrote a lot of the chapters about the really very critical history to understanding the importance of energy and modern economic growth and the prodigious benefits it has conferred for human beings. And Steve has all kinds of wonderful insights into the economics of energy and particularly the opportunities presented by the shale boom. But I'm going to go fast, and I'm probably even going to skip some slides because, again, after a day of many complex and sometimes very dreary issues as far as the potential impacts of climate policies, what I have to offer I think is extraordinarily positive. And a lot of this, the energy part and the environmental parts I've dealt with for about 30 years, but it was only about 2 years ago it was brought to my attention, and it really reflected on how extraordinarily human life, the physical parameters of human life, changed after 1800. That's not very long ago in history. And the greatest change was in this century, and the really greatest change was only since 1950. So we enjoy the affluence, all the ways in which energy amplifies our life in a way that only a couple generations have, and it's somewhat at risk with these grand climate policies. One way to talk about the topic of our book, different title, is the great energy enrichment. And I'd like to point out that it's not corn, that is a wheat field. And ethanol, I think, is one of the most counterproductively and morally offensive of green policies. But, and so here we go. I'm going to skip that one. That one takes explaining. I call this slide the great fact. And the great fact is the incredible trajectory that began around 1800. Straight up. It represents, among other things, modern economic growth. You see the same hockey stick used by a variety of disciplines, but this same dramatic. It's from 0 AD to 2000 and some. But around 8, you had fairly static living conditions, and you had, and what is at stake with all these climate policies is that line going straight up. This is another way to look at it. What it measures, and there are other speakers today that spoke about this, it measures increased in lifespan, increased in the global population, increased in real GDP per capita, that's not an average income, but a real income per capita, and the man-made emissions in fossil fuels, all tracking each other very precisely. What was amazing about this change, this revolution, was not just that there was a lot of economic growth, but for the first time in human history, an economic boom benefited the poor and the average worker the most. It most changed their lives. For all history, there was always a small group of elites, and then everybody else. And before 1800, everybody else just served the small elite. Things started to change there, and energy was one reason. In lifespan 3 times higher, income per capita, that's the really staggering one, 11 to 20. Some people say by 100 times, if you count in the quality of the service we gained, like cell phones, like cars, and on all of that, and the population of the world increased by 8-fold, but there was more food available. Just another little slide to show you just what that means. This is just real income per person, but in England, and that same straight trajectory just shows you very quickly the increasing dependence on coal over about 2 or 3 centuries work. So by the time of the middle of the 19th century, it comes to massively dominate energy use. And that vast economic growth that is astonishing to most economists. And a way of talking about some of the gains is in terms of living standard. People talk about people have always envied this country for the magnitude of our living standard. Here's one way to describe it. In 1875, 74% of average income was just for food, water, clothing, shelter. In 1995, only 13% was spent on the necessities of life, and the rest was discretionary income. Our book argues that fossil fuels was certainly not the cause of the Industrial Revolution, but that it was one of several necessary conditions, meaning that without it, the amount of economic growth, the amount of industrial productivity would have been impossible, but also legal institutions which upheld property rights and economic freedom, and in general, as we did in the 18th century, the inalienable rights of each human individual. This, I think, is an interesting thing. It was implied by what many people said today, but energy consumption, if you measure energy consumption and gross world product, the global version of gross domestic product, energy consumption and gross world product just dovetail each other. It's like a 95% correlation, which does suggest, in statistics, causal-like conditions, but it rose in lockstep, and the volume of it is unbelievable. I think this, now I've been there. Am I going backwards? Yes, I changed. This shows you the kind of volume. These are I kind of like metric units better than the customary units this country used, but look at the difference in 1850. That EJ is exajoule. That's just a measure of energy volume. In 1850, 2.5. In 1900, 22. In 2000, 330 exajoules. And that this just shows you the magnitude of that kind of change. This is something important to Steve and I think. Steve, the economist, free market economist, Julian Simon, who said so many years ago, and Steve worked with him directly. He had these debates with Paul Ehrlich that claimed the world would be rapidly overpopulated, there would be global famine. Because the carrying capacity of the earth, a phrase you heard several times today, would be exceeded by the numbers. And Julian Simon had this famous bet with Paul Ehrlich, the author of The Population Bomb, and a real, as I like the word, misanthrope, regarded humanity with less concern than our Constitution does. But anyway, Julian Simon won all the bets. On the basis of the price and the abundance of various commodities or minerals, but these words to me are very important and a keen way of understanding energy. Energy is the master resource because it enables you to convert. It's not just another natural resource or another mineral. It enables you to transform all the other materials. And in fact, it's a raw material itself. The entire petrochemical industries are best at the use of fossil fuels as a raw material. But the most important is the ultimate resource, and that is as the logic at the bottom of the bottomless well that I spoke about. That's human innovation, if in the context of freedom is allowed to operate. Whoops, oh my gosh, I turned it off. Oh, technical advisor. These look like good global warming type images. Do we just need to, what? Excuse me? Any hope? I could tell you a lot of really good dog jokes, but I'll spare you at this late hour. Oh, you'll catch up? Okay, great. Okay, and oh, I'm going backwards. Okay. I'm not going to read this when Mark, I don't know whether Mark Mills is here, but when he was talking about the Google, Bill Gates and Bill Gates issues with renewables, this is a really profound statement of how impossible is the job of using renewables to fulfill all electricity demand, and really the amount of materials that are used. Instead of reading that, the amount of materials a wind turbine, like about a 3 megawatt wind turbine, uses, for instance, in the amount of concrete and the amount of steel is about 3 times what a natural gas or coal, in rough numbers, a natural gas or coal plant would use. In fact, renewables are not quite so green in many reasons, and it's not just the birds. You ought to see the amount of rebar that goes into the installation of one large, and the amount of concrete for the platform that has to hold a really massive use of materials. And this wasn't talked about today, and tonight's not the night because we need to move fast, but we really need, the book goes into this in some detail. Look closely at what is occurring in Europe, particularly in Germany and the UK, as a result of a very aggressive pursuit of renewables. Retail electric rates in Germany for households 3 times ours, 3 times higher, not 30%, 3 times higher. You can Google energy poverty Germany, or Google electricity as a luxury good Germany, and you get data like 800,000 households can no longer afford electricity, and they reverted to wood. You have a lot of industrial flight from very, very productive and long-standing German industries, some of which have come here because of our great natural gas. The subsidies may reach $1 trillion by 2030. They're subsidizing coal plants to come back online, and they're used 30%, 39% of their renewables, about which they're so proud, is wood. Whoops, I keep wanting to go in the other direction. And just a few images of the glory of energy. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the amount of energy in the most, evanescent. There and gone in an average lightning bolt is unbelievable if we ever learn to harness that. Another one, I like the power plant down below, that mighty, mighty lightning. The sun burns enough hydrogen to meet energy man on the earth for 1,500 million years. So we're not, obviously not energy starved on this, and I'm not going to, just because I know we're late, a lot of the book really tries to, as this whole conference has, to really very carefully but articulate really the stakes and the scope of what's involved. About 60% of the global food supply right now is attributed to the enrichment of fertilizer based on natural gas. This is not just transportation fuels and electricity and heat for manufacturing processes, but the extent of which fossil fuels amplify all kinds of things necessary to human life. About 60% of materials are all made now by fossil fuels. I'm always interested that how we would replace either one of those in any way would be possible. And this is the most profound gift of energy, I think, time. If before the Industrial Revolution and the takeoff of modern economic growth, the overwhelming majority of the population was extremely poor, engaged in very, very arduous manual labor. There was no time for anything. And just look at it in terms of statistics, and these are from you, Steve.
Of course, Obama's reduced the work rate to 20 hours.
But we not only live 3 times longer, but the work, can you imagine 66 hours over 6 days a week? What would that mean is kind of time to have, but with energy has come, this to me is the one that's really an almost spiritual benefit. The others are material or physical, important but physical. But when you have time, you have choice. Unless you live under a tyrant, when you have choice, you can decide what you want to do. The human powers of creativity and can flourish. And that's a pretty special benefit. And this is my last slide. And I came across that picture before I wrote the paper that inspired the book. And I've never forgotten it, because that does not need to occur in this world anymore. We generate enough food, unless ethanol steals a critical mass of it, to feed all of the world's population with a lot left over. The malnutrition and starvation is a problem of access. We have conquered the food supply, and natural gas played a critical role in that. I'm borrowing, and I attributed it. The title was from an editorial that Bjorn Lomborg had just within the last month. But I just thought the title was perfect, that child does not need a solar panel. So I'll stop here tonight. I'm more lively in the morning than in the evening. But I think there's to call it a moving story is trivial. But I think a part of the book really tries to document and tell this story, because I don't think a lot of people have any idea that we are, our generation and the one before us, the first generation to get the full benefit of energy enrichment in our life, from our cell phones to our many cars and devices. And it's transformed the human condition, and that is at risk with these mindless climate policies. And it's just very important that we all understand that further. So, with that, Steve, stay where you are, or come up, or what?
And then, we'd love to take some questions for you all.
Thank you, Brooke, for inviting me. I always love coming to Texas Public Policy Foundation, my favorite state think tank. You guys do an awesome job, and congratulations on the new building. I remember I was here for the groundbreaking. So you built this about 4 times faster than it would if it was a government project. So congratulations. I was just thinking when you showed that last picture. I was in. How many of you have ever been to Africa? Most of you have. I had never been there. I went last year. My niece is in the Peace Corps, and she's in a small, very remote village in Tanzania. And so I spent a week there with her, and some of the happiest people I've ever met in my life, actually. But
Wonderful people, actually. I fell in love with the people there. They were so kind and generous, that even though they have very little. But the thing that was so remarkable to me about that trip was, guess what they don't have? They don't have electricity. They don't, I mean, they're living like it's the 16th century there because they don't have electricity. And so every morning these women get up and they have these big jugs and they put them on their head and they walk a mile down to the river and take the jug and put it on their head and bring it back and so on. And all of the necessities of life are so dependent. I mean, what you learn when you get there after is how vital electric power is to our lives. And it is something that people take so for granted. And one of the things that got me interested in this project was when you wrote the paper, which is so superb on this moral case for fossil fuels. And there is a moral case for this, which is that if we don't have energy, how in the world can these rich Westerners tell these people in poor countries they shouldn't, they're going to have, what, they're going to provide their electricity with windmills and solar power? It's preposterous, really. And one of the points we make in the book is that this whole movement to limit energy, which is really what the whole climate change derangement syndrome is all about, that really is a movement that is going to be a highly regressive tax on poor people. The people who will clearly suffer the most from these policies of making energy more expensive, and that's what the climate change agenda really is about. It's how do you make energy more expensive and less accessible. The people who are going to be hurt by far the most are the people at the bottom. So the left loves to talk. I was just in Boston University last night doing this big debate with 250 people against this liberal professor, and he spent the first half of the debate talking about how horrible income inequality is, and all these people at the bottom, and the poor aren't making any progress in America, and blah, 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 blah. And then he shifts to and by the way, we have to do something about global warming, and we're going to have all these energy taxes. And so I said, Professor, what are you talking about? I mean, he didn't even get the joke. First you talk about how much you care about poor people, now you want to make energy more expensive for the people who need it the most. And this is, by the way, I think a central contradiction of the argument of the left. They care about poor people, but they don't care so much that they're going to make the vital necessities of life much more expensive for them. The way I put it is Tom Steyer, Tom Steyer, he's the one who's funding all these left-wing things. If Tom Steyer's electricity prices go up by 40%, it doesn't make any difference to him. He doesn't care. I mean, he has plenty of money. But the people who do care, people who are living, paycheck to paycheck, and to have a 30 or 40% increase in their utility bills, and it could be a 100% increase if we keep moving away from fossil fuels, that's a huge hardship on low-income people. And that's kind of one of the themes of our book, by the way, is that the people who are going to be hurt the most by these policies are the poor. The second point, look, the big point that I dealt with in the book, and Kathleen is the energy expert, I'm an economist, but I've been working a lot with the presidential candidates and so on, and the big issue is we don't have enough growth in this country. You know that. I mean, the economy has been growing under Obama at 2%, and that's just not enough growth to create the kind of high-paying jobs and the kinds of income gains that Americans would come to expect. And this is the reason Americans are so cranky right now. The American public is cranky. They're angry. It's why you have the rise of Trumpism. People just aren't feeling the love for this recovery. Obama runs around, does the icky shuffle in the end zone about how well things are going, and most people don't feel that way. 40% of Americans feel like according to a series of polls over the last year, 40% of Americans today think America is still in a recession. I mean, here we are, the 6th year of a recovery, and for 40%, they don't think there's been a recovery at all. Now, why is that? It's because there hasn't been enough growth. And so if you look at the average wages and salaries in this country, it's been 10 years now that Americans haven't had a pay raise. So they're cranky. And in fact, for a lot of these people, their real incomes have fallen. Inflation has been rising faster than their paychecks have been rising. And that's the fundamental problem that we're going to have to solve over the next few years. And one of the points that I always make with my friends Larry Kudlow and Art Laffer and Steve Forbes is, look, growth helps solve every problem. Whatever the problem is, the national debt, poverty, climate change, whatever the problem is, if we grow faster, we have the resources to deal with this. And so We've been growing at 2%. We should be growing at 4%. The question then is how do we, and as you know, Jeb Bush and a lot of these other candidates are saying we can grow at 4%. I happen to think that they're right. We can. We could easily grow at 4%. In fact, if anything, I think they're being, too little ambitious. I think we could actually be growing at 5 or 6% because there's so much low-hanging fruit out there after 7 years of Obama of just not doing the real simple things that would increase growth. Well, it turns out that one of the areas where you could get a lot of additional growth almost instantaneously is through energy policy. And if we had a pro-America energy policy, we could increase growth by my calculations in the book by about 1.5 percentage points per year. Now that's a lot. That's huge. That's like $250 billion to $300 billion additional output per year. And how do we do that? Well, we produce our coal, we produce our oil, we produce our gas, and we go after it. And we have plenty of it. And we are, as we say in the book, we're the Saudi Arabia of oil, of natural gas, and of coal. And we ought to be using it for all the reasons that Mark Mills just talked about. So a couple of things that could be done immediately that would have a profound impact on growth. Like, for example, one that would be very simple that President Obama should do immediately would be to just simply lift the ban on exporting oil and gas. I mean, this is craziness. There's no rational reason. This, you all know this. This law goes back to what, 1974 or 1975. It was during the OPEC, era when we had the embargo. But here we are today. We're going to soon be producing, hopefully, we're going to be producing more than we consume. So we're going to need to export this stuff. And we've been talking to a lot of the experts in the field, people like you, sir, and they tell me that if we could lift that ban on exporting, that we could produce about $100 billion a year or more a year starting next year. So $100 billion a year, that's a half a percentage point of GDP right there. So you go from 2 to 2.5%. Then you do some other things. You start drilling on federal lands. Because we've been, as most of you know, 90% of the drilling that's been going on over the last 7 years with all the shale oil and gas, it's been on private lands. Well, guess what? There's a lot of this on public lands. And one of my favorite chapters in the book is the last chapter, which is about what if we started doing that? What if we actually had a president who just said, let's drill on federal lands? Well, it turns out, we talked to one of the world's experts who worked at the Interior Department for many years. He has the whole inventory of what we've got. Well, we're sitting on, we don't know the exact number, but in the tens of trillions of dollars of energy on public lands. And we estimate that if we just starting next year and starting using existing technology, by the way, and the technology obviously always gets better year after year, using existing technology, if we were to start to drill on federal lands, we estimate that for the federal government, this would be a windfall of about $3 to $4 trillion over the next 20 years. That is to say, federal revenues would grow by $3 to $4 trillion. Well, you could do a lot of good with $3 to $4 trillion. And what we recommend in the book is that we split that money for three purposes. Number one, we use some of it to finance the transition to tax reform, so we can get a low rate flat tax. There are going to be some transitional costs, so let's use these energy revenues to kind of fill the gap on that. Second of all, you could start using about a third of the money for building the infrastructure that people say we need to do, improve our roads and highways and pipelines and all of those things. And number three, you could use the rest to retire our national debt. Let's use some of this money to get our $20 trillion debt down. So there's a huge potential there. I'll tell you kind of one funny story. I was giving a talk a couple months ago, and I think it was in Dallas. Maybe one or two you might have been at this, at the Texas Oil and Gas Association meeting. And I started out my speech by saying, I want to congratulate you all people here. I said, you're the people who reelected Barack Obama. They didn't like that very much, right? Because they don't like Obama very much, and Obama doesn't like them very much. But what I meant by that was that, and this is actually, there's no doubt in my mind, that without the shale oil and gas revolution that happened in the last 7 years, there's no way that Barack Obama would have ever been reelected. It just wouldn't have happened, because the U.S. economy would have still been a recession. Almost on net, all of the growth that we saw in Barack Obama's first term was attributable to the shale oil and gas revolution. So but as you said, Kathleen, this is just the start of something really big. I want to make one other point, if I will, and then I'd love to take some questions from you all. What my favorite chapter in the book is the one that you wrote, which is about the Industrial Revolution. And I learned a lot from reading Kathleen's chapters in the book. We've kind of been going back and forth, passing them back and forth. But what's cool about that chapter, and what I learned is, you're exactly right. You show the chart of the two big events that have changed the world were obviously the Industrial Revolution that happened in the late 18th century, and the other, I believe, we're living in right now, which is the Digital Revolution. And these two things are having spectacular growth potentials for the world. And by the way, the drilling revolution that is going on right now is a digital revolution technology. It's all, correct me if I'm wrong, you're doing it, but this is all technology that is due to digital technologies. And so anyway, what's interesting, I think, and fascinating about Kathleen's chapter about the Industrial Revolution is that what we all learned in grade school was, the Industrial Revolution is when modern machinery came into being and we started using automation to produce things. And so you had this huge spurt in output, 4 to 5 times more productive than people were before the Industrial Revolution. What's not told about that, and what I didn't know, is what made the Industrial Revolution possible. And that was, correct me if I'm wrong, fossil fuels. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just a story of machinery, it was a story of energy. And what's interesting about that, and I was telling this left-wing professor this last night, and he was grimacing when I was talking about this, but he's saying, we got to use windmills and so on. Wait a minute, what changed in the late 18th century is people stopped using windmills, and they started using, right? They stopped using windmills, and they started using coal and oil and gas. And why did they do that? Because oil and gas are a much, much better way to generate energy than windmills are. And so, I said, you want to take us back to the Stone Age, because I think that's a little bit about what this is all about. And I'm not a conspiratorialist, as Mark was talking about. I'm not but think about this, though. If you did want to destroy the industrial base of America, how would you go about doing it? Let's think as conspiratorialists. How would you go about doing it? You would destroy our energy supply. And that's the risk that we face. So we've got to get this book, I want to get this all over, the country. I want to get into schools, high schools and grade schools, so people know this history and know what's at stake here. But if we get this right, we're going to see a big boom. And I think Mark is exactly right. And he says that, I sort of steal his line, but if we get this right on energy, not only will the United States in the next 6 or 7 years be energy independent, but I take this a step further and say we are going to be the energy dominant country in the world. And that's what we want, not just for economic reasons, but national security reasons as well. So Kathleen, it's been fun working with you on this. I can't wait for the book to come out. And we're going to just barnstorm around this country selling this message. And thanks to TPPF for sponsoring it. So happy to take any questions people may have.
I'd like to make one comment too. Am my mic still on so I can just speak?
It is.
Which I should have thought of, and I thought of it throughout all the presentations I heard today. What makes fossil fuels so special? I mean, a megawatt's a megawatt of electricity. And why it played such a dynamic role in the beginning of industrialization, and more importantly, in the sustained growth from the initial burst, is its energy content as a matter of physics is far denser than wind or solar. It's what some physicists call power density, or engineers, I don't think really physicists, but the measurement of power, it's far superior. Power density, just for example, it's used as a measure in a variety of different ways, but it estimates the amount really of land or the surface area of the earth consumed or occupied to generate the power. And the difference between, as many speakers spoke today, between wind and sun versus the fossil fuels are stored in the ground. They're a store. As Jim, you and I were talking, renewables energy is a diffused flow that is unpredictable and that humans can't control. Fossil fuels are energy dense, very concentrated, power dense, incredibly versatile, from clothing to fertilizer to pharmaceuticals to heart valves to asphalt. Thousands and thousands of materials are built of those. They're reliable, And most importantly, they can be controlled by human beings. So there's nothing inherently sacred about them, but the qualities inherent in fossil fuels make them an extraordinarily dynamic
So, you know,
resource.
one other quick point, you know, I am
And
not.
then we want to get to some questions.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily, I'm not biased towards fossil fuels. I'm for whatever works, right? I'm an economist. And, you know, so you show me something that works, I'm for it. The problem with windmills, it doesn't work. It's just not a very smart way to get electricity. I was at a major energy conference. It was actually not an energy, a kind of futurist conference a few months ago, and they had an energy expert up there, and he was talking about solar power. And, you know, the future for solar power looks amazingly promising. It's 20 years away, 10, 15, 20 years away. What?
Or 40 years away.
You think that? Well, we don't. Anyway, we don't know. But you know, if we could harness the power of the sun, you know, that would be a huge efficient way to get electricity. Windmills are incredibly inefficient. But the point is, let's take their best estimates and say 20 years we could use solar as a major source of energy. Well, what are we going to do for the next 20 years? We're going to still need fossil fuels. And just one other thing, you know, I think there's a real future for nuclear power too. These smaller nuclear power plants that could be a great way of generating electricity. So I think we as free market conservatives, Brooke, should be for whatever works, whatever's efficient. Shut down the Department of Energy, right? Just shut the damn thing down and let the free market work in energy policy.
So let's, we've got,
Sorry, I had to get that off my chest.
let's, why don't we take a couple questions here, because we do have one more thing we're going to do after this.
Okay.
And Dr. Beisner.
I just wondered if one of you would address the issue of the provision of early energy, initial energy, to places like sub-Saharan Africa, where grid is a long way away, and yet just how much real good can be brought in through, say, solar panels, something like that. How much of a real solution to the life-threatening problems of a place like sub-Saharan Africa are solar panels and wind versus wanting to move toward a full-fledged grid of dispatchable high-scale power?
You know, it's hard to answer that question, because if you're talking about, you know, what would work for the entire continent of Africa, you know, versus, but from what I have read from many sources, the extent to which, like, because I'd like to say, so renewables are fine, but let's not subsidize them, let them find their niche. Again, there's not anything inherently wrong, but that the solar panels have been not worked at all successfully, but maybe because of the limited way in which they've been used. And I just know that those really involved in it, I don't know how to address the grid problem, but that if you look at the early electrification or the final electrification of all kinds of rural area in this country, you had kind of limited transmission systems instead of you know, central grids that worked for not for areas of large population density, but for that. And electricity in the form in which it is transmitted, and then with switches in your house, is so much more versatile and useful than solar. But I don't know whether that answers your question.
So we had a question right here.
Yeah, one of the things that it hasn't been mentioned, and you kind of hinted at, was that this whole green revolution wants to scrap an entire industry and all the technology with it and throw it away. Years, decades from its end of life. And you kind of hinted at that. Would you address that a little bit?
You know,
because the waste is incredible.
It's funny you should bring this up, because you know, I've been thinking about this debate last night that I had against this liberal professor, and you know, he was starkly honest about what he wants, and he basically said, we're going to have a radical transformation of our economy, you know, and we're going to put every oil and gas company out of business, and that's the only way to do this. We have to save the planet. I mean, these are zealots. This is a religious zealot movement, and you know, to hell with they're Stalinists, actually, what they are. Not really, I mean, they're Stalinists. They're people who want to control the whole economy. And you know, what I was saying, I'm for what works, they're for what doesn't work, right? If it doesn't work, they're for it. So, I mean, the whole story of natural gas, which you all know, is, you know, the left was all in favor of natural gas until we had shale oil and gas, and then they were against it because it was cheap and plentiful. So I do think there's a larger, you know, there's a larger agenda here than climate change. I think it's about, I don't know if it's a guilt complex that we have. By the way, the other point, I mean, how many of you've probably seen this, but you know, here they're going to, starting next week or something, they have this big Paris, you know, climate change thing. And the Department of Energy just reported that next year, China and India alone are going to build 500 new coal plants. 500. They're not reducing their carbon emissions. They're not. So what we've got in the United States is basically unilateral economic disarmament. You know, in other words, for every coal plant we shut down, they're going to build 10. How is that going to reduce global warming? And by the way, they estimate that in the next decade there'll be another 1,000 coal plants. So even if we reduced, you know, even if we produce no coal in this country, the emissions from coal are going to continue to go up. My own feeling is, look, if you really believe, you have to have an incredible faith in government to think a government that can't balance the budget, that can't run a single program right, that can't even run a computer program for the healthcare, you know, can't even get the website to work, that they're going to change the way the temperature of the world. I mean, it's this kind of grandiose utopian vision that we need to attack. And let me just say this, I know we have to move on, and you're going to hear about climate change. I said this at the last conference, I'm going to spank you guys a little bit again. Your industry does a terrible job defending yourselves. You know, you just do. As you said, this is the master resource. Everything we have is a result of energy, what you do, and you can't sell it to people. And you better, because you're under assault. And what you do is really the foundation for the modern life that we have. And let's do that. Let's find a way, and maybe our book can be a little part of that. But these guys are coming right at your throats. Right at your throats.
So speaking of the book, when is it going to be out?
April?
February 22nd.
I'll believe that when I see it.
That's no, that's
I think April.
no. Well, that's the publisher's.
Okay.
That's the publisher's published date.
But anyway, I hope, you know, they're great stocking stuffers for 2016, and stimulate the economy and go out and buy them. And,
You want to make a bet right here in front of these people?
I bet you it'll be April, and she's going to bet it's
February 22nd.
You got it.
Wait a minute, what did we bet
I
on?
don't want any part of that.
Anyway, thank you, Brooke, for bringing me out again. I'll see you all in the morning. And so, great.
So any last, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, you have one last question, this is it.
Talking from the oil industry standpoint, let me first tell you that the future looks extremely bright. The cooperation between all the oil companies now is intense. So we're getting fast development of new technology in order and how to drill these horizontal wells and how to do this new frac treatment.
Right.
And every time somebody does something new, the service companies pick it up and transfer it to all the rest of them. There are no patents. There's nothing, no withholding of any information. We now have gotten to the point that we have maybe as many as 100,000 locations to drill if you can give us oil back up to about $70 a barrel. So,
Wow.
it's
Wow.
it's a tremendous amount here in all the three major basins. You know, the Wolfberry and the Permian Basin, and the Eagle Ford and the Bakken.
Right.
It's just that so the future looks extremely bright.
Oh, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah, why haven't we done a better job?
Yeah.
And the main reason is probably the main thing is we don't know how to get a good job.
Right.
And we haven't been told. And the other thing is that we've been too busy working.
Well, you know,
I gave a talk before another group that said, I said, okay, you got the problems of the oil price coming down, and then you've got the problems of the federal government, the EPA.
Yeah.
I said, The EPA is by far the largest.
Of course.
And you better start thinking about that. And of course, the EPA is now, like you say, is really gonna hurt us again. So, we realize it's there and we just don't know how to tackle it. But we're learning how to tackle it.
Okay.
And Texas public policy is one of the main ways we can attack it.
So,
Well, you know, Barack Obama said, when he announced that he wasn't gonna build the Keystone Pipeline, I mean, that's another thing we need to do is build pipelines in this country, obviously. And, you know, he made this stunning statement. He said, I'm sorry, we're just gonna have to keep this stuff in the ground. We're sitting on a $10 trillion buried treasure. And I mean, can you imagine Saudi Arabia 40 years ago saying, yeah, we've got, you know, more oil than everybody else and we're not gonna use it. But just one statistic to leave you with that's in the book that just, I'd love to see your industry promoting this. Every time the price of gasoline at the pump drops by 1 penny, that puts $1 billion more money into the hands of American consumers that they can buy on other things. You know, going to McDonald's or going to the restaurant. That makes a big difference. Just show ads at the people at the gas station. How do you like $1.89 gasoline? They love it, you know. Well, guess what? Barack Obama wants to take it back to $3.89 a gallon. That kind of thing would be such an effective way to promote what is the fundamental industry in America that is propelling all the growth that we have. So.
please thank our authors.
Okay. All right, Kathleen. That was